Hi, I'm Laura, and this is my channel where I talk about work, life, and everything in between. Last time, I gave a deep dive into modeling techniques and the model development process. So now you've developed your model, you put together all the datasets, codes, and the documentation, and you submit it for validation. You're done, right? Not quite. In fact, I'd argue that fitting the model is only part of the job. Sometimes not even the hardest part. Because in credit risk, your model needs to pass independent model validation and be maintained often for years. So in this video, I will talk about model validation from the perspective of a credit risk model developer and what you need to do as a model developer. In credit risk, model validation is an independent challenge process designed to answer one core question. Can this model be trusted to make real financial decisions, not just today, but over time and across economic conditions? A model validator will question and challenge you on your model and the choices you made while building the model. From a developer's perspective, model validation can feel adversarial, but model validation's role is not to give you a hard time or to prove your model is bad. It's to independently assess model risk, challenge assumptions, and make sure the model is defensible beyond you. Because if they have questions while reviewing your model, most likely regulators would have similar questions. Validators need to consider regulators, auditors, senior management, and future users who weren't involved in development. So when validation asks tough questions, it's not personal. Furthermore, credit risk modeling is very different from general data science. These models directly affect credit decisions, pricing, capital, and provisions under IFRS 9 or CECL. So naturally, they get a lot of scrutiny. And the regulators don't just ask, does the model perform well? They ask, does this model make sense? Can you explain it? Will it behave reasonably during a downturn? And can it be monitored and maintained? That's why, in credit risk, a model that performs well but can't pass validation is basically unusable. One of the biggest mistakes that model developers make is assuming that validators think like model developers. They don't. Validators are not thinking, how can I improve this genie? Or what's the most elegant statistical solution? They're asking a very different set of questions. In fact, from my experience, a lot of people from data science backgrounds coming into credit risk modeling are surprised by how rigorously they need to justify their modeling choices beyond just model performance. Once you understand how validators think, the validation process will make more sense and you will have a much smoother validation. The first thing a credit risk model validator would ask is, does this model fulfill its intended purpose? They need to understand, what was this model built to do? How is this supposed to be used in the business? And does the design of the model actually support that use? One of the fastest ways a model can fail validation is when the model design doesn't match its stated purpose. For example, let's say you build a PD model intended for acquisition decisions. If that model uses information that is only available after the customer is booked, like behavioral variables or post-origination performance data, then from a validation perspective, the model already has a fundamental problem, even if the performance looks great. Then the validator would question, does this model make sense from a credit perspective? They care about the methodology you choose and assumptions you make, and whether the direction, shape, and behavior of the model align with basic credit intuition. For example, does higher leverage increase risk? Does weaker repayment capacity increase PD? Do relationships behave monotonically where we expect them to? If a variable improves performance but behaves strangely at certain risk bands, or you make unintuitive assumptions with no justification, that's immediately a concern. Because in credit risk, if validation approves your model, they will need to be comfortable defending it to regulators. A model that doesn't make intuitive sense is hard to defend, no matter how well it performs. Third, validators will have a risk view towards the model and think more in terms of, how could this model fail? So that they would be able to answer those same questions if a regulator challenges why they passed the model. They're constantly asking, is your data reliable? What happens in a downturn? What if the portfolio mix changes? What if this relationship breaks? What assumptions are we making implicitly? This is why validation also looks at stability, robustness, and sensitivity analysis. A model that performs extremely well in benign conditions but behaves unpredictably under stress can be considered risky, even if its average performance looks great. They want to see performance over time through backtesting, behavior in weaker economic periods, and consistency across vintages through long-run stability metrics. In credit risk, models are expected to live for years, not just until the next deployment. Additionally, validators are not just reviewing your model. They're asking, could someone else understand, use, and maintain this model in 3 years? That's why they push back on overly complex logic, undocumented adjustments, or models that rely heavily on individual knowledge. You need to have clear rationale and traceable decisions. From a validator's perspective, model risk increases when a model depends too much on the original developer. If a model can't be understood beyond its creator, it's fragile. Now that you understand how credit risk model validators think, let's talk about what that looks like in practice. Validation is a structured, step-by-step review of model risk. After you submit your datasets, code, and model documentation to validation, they will first perform a review to ensure that they have sufficient information to be able to perform the validation. If any information is glaringly lacking, they will request it from you or even turn down the validation request until you provide the necessary information. Once they deem that they have sufficient information to perform the validation, they will go through a series of reviews and tests. Throughout this review, the model validator may send you clarification questions, ask you to perform additional analysis to support your modeling choices, as well as challenge you on your choices and prompt you to consider alternative approaches. Model validators will review your model documentation and check for the following information. 1. Model purpose and use cases. They need a very clear understanding of the intended use case, the population, and portfolio. Validators will ask, is this an acquisition model, behavioral model, pricing model, capital model, or provisioning model? Who uses the output and how? If there's a mismatch here, validation will stop you early. 2. Data assessment. Availability, representativeness, and quality. Once purpose is clear, validators look closely at the data. Not just whether it's clean, but whether it's appropriate and representative. They will check things like, the data source you choose is a reliable and controlled source. You didn't make any critical omissions when cleaning the data. Your data cleansing steps make sense. The data elements you choose will be available at the time of use. Your data is representative of the portfolio and covers the periods in the credit cycle as appropriate. And you have sufficient default observations in your data. 3. Methodology and model design and assumptions. Next, validators review how the model was built. This includes choice of modeling approach, segmentation strategy, variable selection and transformations, and the treatment of expert judgment. They're not necessarily looking for the most advanced techniques. They just want to ensure that the method is appropriate for the problem and that the assumptions are clearly stated and reasonable. In credit risk, a simpler, more transparent model is often preferred over a more complex one, especially if both perform similarly. Validators will check the accuracy of the information against the code and datasets you provide, and potentially independently replicate the model. That's why documentation is so important, and your documentation needs to be clear and comprehensive enough so that someone else can independently replicate the model. 4. Model performance and testing. When validators look at model performance, they consider rank ordering, calibration, stability over time, and performance across segments. If there is degradation in performance, they would want to know why. Validators would review your test results and perform their own testing as well. Additionally, especially in credit risk, validators will want to check the model sensitivity and how it behaves in stress situations. They would test things like, what happens if macro variables move sharply? Do PDs behave sensibly under stress scenarios? Are results driven by a small number of variables? Another key step during model testing is that validators can build their own benchmark model. They wouldn't do this for every model, but for models with high risk and high impact, they may build a benchmark. This is done to independently check that your model's performance is reasonable and see if simpler or alternative approaches perform just as well. 5. Model implementation, monitoring, and maintenance plans. Validators will want to know how the model will be implemented and how it will be monitored. You will need a clear plan on how the model will fit into the system and how the system will be tested to ensure that the model was accurately implemented. You will also need to have a clear monitoring plan which defines which metrics you will monitor and what frequency and what actions you will take if the metrics breach. Validators want to get comfort that if something goes wrong with the model, there's monitoring to pick up the issue in a timely manner and actions will be taken to address the issue. They may challenge you on your monitoring plan if it lacks clarity, if they believe your metrics are insufficient, or if they believe your thresholds are too lax. After performing all these reviews, validators would write a validation report that outlines what they checked and their findings. Depending on whether they found any severe issues, they will provide either an approval, a conditional approval, or a rejection. If your model is approved, then it can be implemented and used. If it has a conditional approval, then you may need to do additional work to make sure your model satisfies the conditions for it to be used, or limit the use of your model so that it does not violate the conditions. If your model is rejected, then your model should not be used, and you would need to make some significant changes and resubmit for validation. When validation gives you findings, they could be at different levels of severity. While different banks can name their issue levels differently, most use a 3-tier or 4-tier system. The issue severity depends on the impact to model reliability and decision-making. Issues at the most severe level, which are called high-severity, material, or critical issues, materially impacts model outputs or decisions, and the results cannot be relied upon without remediation or controls. Immediate remediation would be required and model use may be restricted or suspended. The submission could be rejected as well. Senior management would also be notified. These issues are often tied to regulatory findings. Some examples of high severity issues are use of information not available at decision time, incorrect implementation of the model in code causing significant errors in model output, conceptual flaws that significantly bias PD, LGD, or EAD estimates, or cause the model to output nonsense results such as a negative PD, calibration errors affecting capital or pricing, or critical assumptions do not hold. Medium severity or moderate issues indicate that the model is usable, but weaknesses increase risk and could become material under stress or over time. This means that remediation would be required within a defined timeline while the model remains in production. Remediation progress would be tracked through issue management. Some examples of medium severity issues are performance deterioration in certain segments, inadequate data treatment, insufficient rationale for key assumptions, the need for additional testing and analysis over time. Low severity or minor issues do not materially impact model results, and they focus more on robustness, clarity, and governance. They still need to be fixed, but are ranked at lower priority and typically have a longer timeline for remediation. Some examples of low severity issues are minor documentation gaps where details are missing, minor inconsistencies between code and documentation, missing some supporting analysis, or non-standard reporting formats. Lastly, there is a non-issue level typically called observations and recommendations, which are optional. They are not formal findings and can be seen as suggestions for best practices or future improvement. Examples of recommendations include additional segmentations to explore, alternative performance metrics, or potential data enhancements. One important mindset shift is that validation is not an exam where you pass or fail. It's a challenge process where you have the opportunity to further improve your model and documentation. And how you respond to questions and findings often matters just as much as the findings themselves. During validation, try to answer the validator's clarifying questions promptly. This helps them move forward with the validation. Otherwise, they may make inaccurate assessments based on a flawed understanding of your model. If validation asks you to perform additional analysis to support your rationale, you don't have to do it right away if you have other higher priority tasks to do, but if you leave it until the end of validation, it could become a finding. When you do get findings, don't take them personally. I know, as model developers, we put a lot of work into our models and want to take pride in them. So when model validators challenge our work, it could sting. But remember, you could have a technically strong model and it could still receive findings. That's just validation's job in a regulated environment. When you read the findings, try to understand what is the core problem that validation is pointing to. Validators may propose remediation steps, but you may be able to find a more efficient way to address the core problem. So, it's important to get a good understanding of the core problem instead of just following the validator's recommendations. Sometimes you may even disagree with the finding. If so, you'll need to be professional and objective when presenting your argument. You'll need to clearly state which part you disagree with and why, and provide factual evidence. If there are residual limitations, you should acknowledge them and propose monitoring or controls if necessary. Findings usually come with a timeline for fixing them. Validators don't expect you to make everything perfect right away. Even if you can't resolve a finding right away, you should come up with a practical plan to resolve the finding within the timeline and communicate it with your validators. While validators are supposed to be independent, sometimes you can get informal feedback early on that lets you know if the validators don't think your plan will work. That way, you don't waste time going down the wrong path. And that wraps up this deep dive on model validation. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. Have questions or thoughts? Drop them in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching. Bye.